It's me again. Time to get rid of your phone so you don't have to keep watching me or listening to me. This is part two of my explanation of question three, or my, expansion of question three about is the Bible reliable, or is it the source of information about God, the way to connect with Him, His plan of salvation, His plan for us, His plan for human beings, etc. And one of the greatest proofs, in my opinion, is the record of Genesis. And it's amazing because it gets discredited and attacked a lot by people who don't understand how it was written, the genre of literature it is, and how it's supposed to be used. Even Christians fight over whether or not the 7 days of creation in Genesis 1 and 2 are literal 7 days or eras of time. I believe they're eras of time. The word in the word yom, which is used for day in Genesis, can literally be translated as epoch, like an undisclosed amount of time. There's evidence to suggest that that's exactly how the author intended them to be used. Quickly, I'll just say that the seventh day of creation does not have an evening and morning statement at the end of it. And in Hebrews, written, I don't know, 1,000 years, 1,500 years later, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 3, it tells us that when we come to faith in Christ, we enter that 7-day rest, and it quotes from Genesis to refer to the seventh day. Well, here's the thing. If the seventh day is 24 hours, how do we enter it by faith? Can't enter it at all. It's done. It's been over for thousands of years. How could we get into it, right? But the author of Hebrews is very clear that when we believe, we enter that rest that God started at the end of creation. Well, if that seventh day is still ongoing, then it's been, 10,000 years long? So the word day, yom, epoch, fits, doesn't it? And my point is, if the seventh day can be 10,000 years or longer, why can't the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth day be longer? And the evening and morning statements in Genesis are merely statements of closure, poetic statements of closure. And we could go on and on about that and about the genre of Genesis. I'm not going to do that. But what I do want to show or point out is how there are certain things mentioned in Genesis 1 that once you get past the day-age question and you just look at the order of events and what's actually said, it's astounding because there are things that Moses, who I believe wrote it, but even if you don't believe it was Moses, okay, some sheep herder in the Middle East 3,500, 4,000 years ago or more wrote stuff that we didn't claim to have discovered here in modern times until the 19th, 20th, or maybe 21st century in some cases. And I'm just going to give you a couple examples. So the first thing is sort of the assumption of God as the source of the Big Bang. If you saw my introductory video to the question of God that I've already posted on Facebook, I talk about how science has postulated creation without a creator, or more specifically, God without a brain. All the attributes of God are given to the Big Bang, the little pinpoint of matter and energy that science agrees, blew up to create the universe. All the attributes of God are given to that little pinpoint except one. We say it was the source of all power, all energy in the universe. Well, that's omnipotence, which is a divine attribute. Theologians have understood that for centuries, right? We say that little pinpoint blew up and everything came from it, so it is everywhere present. And that's omnipresence. That is a divine attribute, an attribute of God. We say it was self-existent. It was always there. When you ask scientists, where did the little pinpoint of energy come from that caused the Big Bang, they just say, well, it was just there. Well, if it's self-existent and eternal, it has no source, it is divine. That's those are attributes of God. So all the attributes of God are given to this little thing that blew up, except one, and that's intelligence. And my question in the book is, why would we want God without a brain unless we just don't want him to tell us what to do? If he has no brain, he can't really give us orders, and we can do our own thing. And that's exactly what Genesis teaches as well regarding the fall of man, but that's another subject for another day. What I do want to show you, though, is amazing. So the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. John 1 tells us he spoke, and they were created. So God is the source of the Big Bang. I love the bumper sticker that says, I believe in the Big Bang. God spoke, and bang, it happened. It's basically true. But then verse 2 says the earth was without form and void. It was just like a blob. And science says that once the Big Bang occurred, all the matter of the universe was spread in all directions, and it was just like chunks and pieces and unformed blobs of material. And that's exactly what Genesis 1 verse 2 says. And my question is, how did Moses figure that out? I mean, there's no record of that in ancient history, ancient literature. That's not what ancient man believed about the origin of the earth, the origin of the universe. How did Moses find out? Was he just really smart, or did he guess? Or was he told by the one who did it? Then he says that God said, let there be light, and there was light, verse 3. Well, that's another thing science says. Initially, after the Big Bang, stars had not engaged. They had not started to burn. The chemical reactions necessary for starlight had not initially begun, and probably didn't for some time, until these planetary matter, these planetary bodies composed of matter, began to form or began to circulate based on gravity, and an orbits were formed. And then the energy that was also a part of the Big Bang was surrounding some of these blobs of material or matter. And when the right chemicals came together, they ignited and formed stars as we know them. So light would have come after the Big Bang and after these formless, dark matter chunks were floating around the universe and started to revolve around each other. And actually, they would also say that those orbits weren't fully established, which we'll get to in a later verse here. But then go a little further. And I'm skipping a bunch of stuff, too. I'm just going to the highlights. All right, so then verse 7, God made a firmament, an atmosphere, or heaven, as he calls it, and divided the waters. It says that, oh man, I already skipped that, too. Well, he talks about that there was water and liquid on the face of the deep, verse 2. Well, the idea that the earth is molten liquid, and that initially it was mostly liquid, and that initially it was mostly covered with water, is a scientific fact that was, quote, proven in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, the early part of the 20th century. How did we figure that out? Well, we had evidence of archaeology and geology and so forth. How did Moses know it, though, thousands of years before? Nobody else wrote about that or believed it at the time. But somehow he knew this. Then comes the atmosphere, which again science would agree with. First it's a blob, then it starts to take shape as it starts to go into orbit. Then there's light because the stars ignite, and then it's mostly liquid and covered with water, and then the atmosphere begins to form as a result of some of the chemical processes occurring on the face of the earth. And that's exactly what Genesis records as the next step. This atmosphere is formed. And then it says, he gathers the water and land appears. And first he gathers the water into one place and land appears. And then he forms seas in verse 10. This is verse 9 and 10 of Genesis 1. Okay, well, think about that. So if the earth is completely covered with water and then land appears, you have a single landmass. But then to form seas, what has to happen? That landmass has to break up. Well, we just recently were just discussing and discovering that, and we can see it on the globe. As you look at the globe, I've got one right here. You look at the globe, you look at the major continents, they kind of all fit together. If you put them all together into one landmass, the pieces kind of go like a puzzle. And most scientists today do believe that at one point, all the continents were one uber continent and they broke up. Well, that's exactly what Moses is writing here. How the heck did he figure that out? Some would say, aliens told him. Okay, well, where did the aliens come from? I love that argument. I talk about that in my first video, too. Not for you, but the one I did online on Facebook. Ben Stein's documentary that he did years ago called Expelled, he went around and interviewed some of the greatest scientific minds of our time. And he challenged them because they were refusing to accept the possibility of intelligent design. And they were firing scientists who were even open to it. They just get rid of them. And he called them on it. So why would you do it? The scientific evidence, scientific theory, and methods says you should consider all possibilities. Why are you not considering this one? And they're kind of hemming and hawing and dancing. He finally says, well, if you don't accept God, then where did life come from? And you know what their two answers were? Aliens or crystals. And you can look at my video to hear more about that, or go get Expelled. It's you can rent it or download it online. I think it's on YouTube. But I mean, aliens and crystals, that's more acceptable as a source of life than God? Why does that make more sense? Or why is that more logical? Or why is that considered more scientific? I mean, it's insane, right? So anyway, Moses had help here, and I would suggest it was divine help. So he figures out the continental shift, basically, somehow, or knows about it, writes about it. And then he starts talking about the order life appears on earth. Again, something we didn't understand until the 20th century. He says first it was plant life, algae, grass, etc. And then sea life, and then birds. And he talks about great creatures of the sea. He talks about the full establishment of our time system and the rotation of Earth around the sun, the 24-hour periods. Again, science would agree that that didn't come into play right away. It came later. Then he talks about, the sea life and great creatures of the sea, verse 21. And it's interesting, the King James originally put that, or had translated that as sea monsters. Is he describing dinosaurs here? Is he saying that, in essence, at the same time as birds, there were dinosaurs? Well, if you saw Jurassic Park, you know that scientists in the latter part of the 20th century came to believe that dinosaurs were not lizards or reptiles. They were actually more closely related to birds. Similar bone structure, hollow bones, flocking tendencies, similar feeding tendencies. Well, guess what? Right here in verse 20 and 21 of Genesis 1, Moses tells us that birds and great creatures of the sea, some, again, translators say sea monsters, were created at the same time. And that's exactly what science has, quote, discovered, unquote. Interesting. Where did he figure this out? How did he know this? And the other thing that's amazing in this, and I'll end with this idea, is that man comes last. And that man is unique in ways that science can't explain. So look, Darwin said man was the result of an evolutionary chain, and that everything we've been talking about here is just a chain of evolution, one species transferring to the next, with trans-species mutation being the means by which that happened. Well, Genesis agrees with the order, simple plant life all the way up to mammals and man, but Genesis does not agree with the means. Genesis says God did it, and he drew a line between each one. Each one after its kind, it says. Each one would create after its kind, or recreate after its kind. Well, isn't it interesting that we can't find examples of transspecies mutation? Darwin said that if the fossil record was not filled with millions of examples of transspecies mutation, missing links, we would call them, he said that his theory should be thrown aside, should be cast out, shouldn't be considered. Well, we haven't found any. When I was in school, when you were in school, they used to have this picture of a fossil they called Archaeopteryx, which is supposed to be a reptile-bird combination. It's not in textbooks anymore. You know why? Because they've since discovered that it was two fossils mashed together. It's not one animal. There are no examples of transspecies mutation in the fossil record. But what we do have are clear examples of each kind or species progressively building over time from simple plant life to mammals, which is exactly what Genesis 1 records, unlike any other ancient document, or frankly, even scientific document until the 20th century. How in the world did Moses know that stuff? Unless, as he claims, God told him. Just one of thousands of proofs that the Bible is an accurate source of God's plan, God's existence, how to know him, how to come to him, how to walk with him, how to serve him, how to have a life that's successful. So I hope that's helpful. Love you. Let me know, because I'm working on this. And I'll have more to say about some of the other questions too later. Okay? See ya.